doing it? All right, let's do it. There are always going to be consequences when someone has 500,000 barrels of oil taken offline. Now 600, and then advance to 700, and then 800,000 barrels of oil offline per day because their refineries got taken out. 16 refineries, 5 oil supply depots where they have those big old tanks offline. It'll take a year to get them back online. The Russians are going to lose 7.2 billion as a result, while they're burning a hole of 250 billion in gold in their sovereign wealth fund because they're fighting a conflict that they chose to get into with Ukraine. And some would say, well, so what? Well, I would say it's not our fight. Our kith and kindred are the ones that pay the price for it. I'll lay it out for you neat and tidy. When you take that much oil off the market on a daily basis, someone is going to notice. And the markets internationally have noticed. So fuel costs go back up. That drives up inflation. When you go to the store and take an item off the shelf, why is it going back up in price again? The transportation costs. Oil, diesel, and gasoline. It is so bad, even the Russians, they were forced to put a ban on the export of their own gasoline. And now they are importing gasoline from Belarus. Belarus only has 2 refineries. There's only 15 million of them, give or take. There are 150 million Russians, give or take. And they're grabbing every drop of gasoline they can get out of Belarus because their capacity to refine has been decreased by the Ukrainian drones. It's math. You start a fight, you get punched in the mouth. They're getting punched in the mouth. It's one thing to be losing almost 500,000 troops in less than 3 Earth years, when the ones that you're fighting only have a population of 40 million before you've invaded, and you're much larger than they are, yet they are still beating the brakes off of you. At one point, you had a large amount of the land. Now you're down to 18% of the land that you seized. The Russians have an advantage in particular things. However, they're getting taken out and taken down by drones. Little rinky-dink drones taking out $12 million in gold pieces of equipment and more. The longer this thing drags out, the greater the impact on global financial activity. So-called China, so-called India, they're not buying gasoline and diesel and oil products from the Russians anymore because the sanctions are biting even harder than they were already. They're on the 3rd tier of sanctions, and they are biting very deep. And so now you have all these Russian ships and ships that have Russian oil and diesel fuel aboard that are being refused even by so-called China and so-called India now. And the banks are slowing up the payment processing on the Russians. It could take them up to a year or 2 years to get some of the payments that they're expecting, while they're burning through their sovereign wealth fund at an alarming rate, which is why they got 16% inflation and record bankruptcies right now in Russia. And all that impacts global capital. So the impacts ripple. And when you see how all those things play out, the Russians attacked Ukraine, a massive supplier of food for Alkebu-lan and the Ab.Zu, and what some call the Middle East, or as I would say, Northeast Alkebu-lan. Now, the Black Sea Fleet of the Russians have been basically neutralized by default. So the grains are flowing out again. And despite the Russians taking out some of the grain silos and things of this nature where they stored things for shipment. The Ukrainians are now getting grain back out onto the market. However, the damage has already been done on the mother continent. Food, in terms of tie back to grains and rice, mega expensive. And folks are crying hard. The issue is not so much the grain, it's flowing out again, just at smaller rates now. The bigger issue is the fertilizer. We keep coming back to discussions about fertilizer because Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are large suppliers of fertilizer, and Belarus with the potash. And they're all in conflict and sanctioned. Well, not all. Ukraine is the victim of the Russians, so they're not being sanctioned. Now, our kith and kindred on the mother continent, the guys who have the guns and have the control, if you would, their arms supplier is Russia. So they'll do whatever Moscow tells them to do against their own interests of their populations. They need those grains, and the Russians can't get them enough grains. It's a mess. And now parties are back to the BRICS nonsense again. The lack of fertilizer, right here, misnomer quote unquote Brazil, they can't afford that fertilizer. And they need 3 times the amount just to grow anything because their soil is more sand than soil. Corporate so-called Argentina, excellent soil, can't afford the fertilizer. So that's the problem between the B in BRICS and the R in BRICS. The fertilizer issue started with the Russians attacking Ukraine. That hurts corporate quote-unquote Brazil. So B and R, so-called Brazil and so-called Russia, are not on the same page regarding that part. New Delhi refuses to pay in rubles for the Russian oil. And I'm not taking any of the oil, as I said, or the diesel, or the gasoline, because there's sanctions. Same thing with so-called China. That's the R, the I, and the C and BRICS not on the same page. And idiots across the planet are like, oh my goodness, great, there's a BRICS currency. Morons. I don't get how this is hard to figure out. So when folks are talking about a quote-unquote BRICS currency backed by nothing and no one, if I'm forced to ask the question, are they high, drunk, or stupid? Or are they all of that at the same time? Mind blown at the mental retardation that folks don't see what's going on here. And worse, they don't act accordingly. You cannot be that dumb your whole life.